a world of peril and prayer. For a long time, people thought the Middle Ages had no real idea of childhood. The common picture was of children dressed like tiny adults, put to work as soon as they could walk. The idea was that they were just small, imperfect versions of grown-ups, and that once they were past infancy, they were thrown into the adult world without a second thought. But that view is too simple. It's not quite right. Medieval people knew children were different. They just saw that difference through a very different lens than we do today. Their world was harder, more fragile, and shaped by a faith that was woven into every part of life. The first thing to understand is that life was incredibly dangerous for a child. Not surviving was the first and biggest hurdle. Historians estimate that maybe a third of all children died before they reached the age of 5. Some places and times were worse. Disease was everywhere. A simple fever, a cough, or an infection could be a death sentence. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs. Childbirth itself was a huge risk for both the mother and the baby. So, from the very beginning, a child's existence was precarious. This constant presence of death shaped how parents thought about their children. It's not that they didn't love them. The letters and legal documents from the time show parents grieving deeply for lost children. But they also had a kind of emotional defense. You might not get as attached to an infant who had a high chance of not making it to their first birthday. Love was there, but it was guarded by a heavy dose of realism. Religion was the framework for everything. The Catholic Church taught that every baby was born with original sin. This was a stain on their soul from the fall of Adam and Eve. If a baby died without being cleansed of the sin, their soul could not enter heaven. This was a terrifying thought for medieval parents. It made baptism incredibly important. It wasn't just a nice family ceremony. It was an urgent, essential ritual to save a child's soul. Priests urged parents to have their babies baptized as soon as possible after birth, sometimes on the very same day. This shows that parents cared immensely about their child's eternal fate, which was, to them, far more important than their earthly life. This idea of original sin also meant that children weren't seen as perfect, innocent angels. They were seen as fundamentally flawed, just like adults. They were innocent in the sense that they hadn't committed serious sins yet, but they had the capacity for evil. They were prone to laziness, disobedience, and selfishness. So, a parent's job wasn't just to feed and clothe a child. It was to discipline them, to beat the sin out of them, quite literally sometimes. Physical punishment was common and seen as a necessary act of love. The Bible was often quoted, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." They believed they were saving their child's soul by teaching them obedience to God and their parents. The family structure was also different. We think of the nuclear family, but for many, the household was bigger. It could include grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even servants or farmhands. A child grew up surrounded by a community, but the relationship with parents might seem distant to us. In noble families, children were often sent away at a young age. Boys went to other households to be trained as knights, and girls went to learn how to manage a great estate. Even among common people, children were part of the family's economic unit. They were another pair of hands to help with the work. This wasn't cruel, it was just a practical reality. Everyone had a role to play in keeping the family afloat. So childhood existed. It was recognized as a distinct phase of life, but it was not a protected, carefree time like we imagine today. It was a period of intense vulnerability, spiritual shaping, and practical training for a difficult adult life that might come all too soon. The first 7 years survival and swaddling, the first stage of a medieval child's life, was all about survival. From the moment of birth, the odds were stacked against them. The birth itself took place at home, usually with a midwife and other women from the village or family. Men were almost never present. The midwife was a crucial figure, relying on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. But without modern medicine, a difficult birth could easily end in tragedy. If the baby survived the delivery, the next few weeks were the most critical. A newborn infant was immediately plunged into a world of ritual and practical care. The first act was often a bath, followed by being rubbed with salt. This was thought to toughen the skin and ward off evil spirits. Then came swaddling. The baby would be wrapped tightly from head to toe in long strips of linen cloth. To us, this looks constricting and cruel, but they had their reasons. They believed a baby's limbs were soft and needed to be held straight so they would grow properly. It also kept the baby warm, as houses were cold and drafty, and a swaddled baby was easier to manage. It was like a neat little package that could be carried, hung from a peg on the wall, or laid in a cradle while the mother got on with her work. The baby would stay swaddled for most of its first year, only being unwrapped for cleaning. Feeding was the next challenge. Breastfeeding was the norm. Mother's milk was understood to be the best food for a baby. But among the nobility, it was a different story. It was fashionable for wealthy women not to breastfeed their own children. They thought it was something commoners did, and they wanted to be available to their husbands in society. So they would hire a wet nurse. A wet nurse was a woman, usually a peasant, who had recently had her own child and could breastfeed the noble baby. This was a risky business. The wet nurse's health and diet directly affected the baby. If she was sick, the baby could get sick, and there was always the fear that the baby would absorb the wet nurse's low-born qualities through her milk. But it was a common practice. The wet nurse would often take the baby to her own home for the first year or two, meaning the noble child spent its earliest years in a humble cottage, separated from its own parents. As the child grew out of swaddling clothes and began to crawl and then walk, new dangers appeared. A medieval home was a hazardous place. The center of the house was the open hearth, a constantly burning fire for cooking and heat. Toddlers could easily fall into it. Wells were often uncovered. Animals like pigs and dogs wandered freely in and out of the house. So medical texts from the period are full of warnings about children falling into fires, drowning in wells, or being attacked by animals. Parents were busy with endless work and couldn't watch a child every second. Accidents were tragically common. The church divided life into stages, and the first 7 years were considered the age of innocence. A child under 7 was not thought to be capable of forming rational intent. They couldn't really understand the difference between right and wrong in a meaningful way. This meant they couldn't be held legally or spiritually responsible for their actions. If a 6-year-old committed a crime, they weren't punished in the same way an adult would be. And if they died, they were considered innocent, and if baptized, would go to heaven. But this period of innocence ended abruptly at the age of 7. This was a major turning point. The church called it the Age of Reason. At 7, a child was thought to be able to start understanding moral concepts. They could begin to learn their prayers properly, go to confession, and be held accountable for their sins. This was the age when their formal education and training for life would begin in earnest. The first 7 years were a gauntlet of survival. If a child made it through, they were no longer seen as a fragile infant. They were a person ready to start learning their place in the world. They had survived, and now their real work could begin. Mere learning and leisure work disguised as play. Once a child reached the age of 7, their life changed. They entered the Age of Reason, and their focus shifted from mere survival to learning and training. But education in the Middle Ages was not what we think of today. For the vast majority of children, there was no school. No classrooms, no books, no teachers. Their education was entirely practical, learned by watching, listening, and doing. It was a long apprenticeship for the life they were born into. For a peasant child, the world was their classroom. A boy would follow his father into the fields. He would start with simple tasks. His first job might be to scare birds away from the newly sown seeds. He would learn to gather firewood, to look after the pigs or sheep. As he got stronger, he would learn to handle a hoe, then an ox, and finally a plow. His education was in the rhythms of the seasons: when to plant, when to weed, when to harvest. A girl would learn from her mother. She would start by fetching water from the well, spinning wool into thread, and watching the cooking fire. She would learn to bake bread, brew ale, mend clothes, tend the small vegetable garden, and make cheese. This wasn't just chores, this was her schooling. Her survival and the survival of her future family depended on mastering these skills. Formal education was a privilege reserved for a tiny few, mostly boys from wealthy or noble families. Some might be sent to a monastery school or a school attached to a cathedral. There they would learn to read and write, but only in Latin. Latin was the language of the church, of law, and of all serious learning. Their curriculum was based on the Seven liberal arts, which included subjects like grammar, rhetoric, and arithmetic. The teaching methods were harsh, rote memorization was key, and discipline was strict. The birch rod was a standard piece of classroom equipment. For the very brightest, this path could lead to a university, but that was incredibly rare. Noble girls were sometimes taught to read, usually in their own language rather than Latin, so they could read prayer books or poetry. But their main education was in managing a large household, a complex and demanding job. It's easy to think that medieval childhood was all work and no play, but that's not true. Children played. We know this from archaeological finds and from illustrations in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Monks, bored with copying serious texts, would sometimes draw little scenes of daily life, including children playing games. Their toys were simple, usually homemade. Girls had dolls made of cloth or wood. Boys had wooden swords and toy knights, practicing for a life of warfare. They played with spinning tops, hoops, and marbles made of clay or stone. They played with knuckle bones, the ankle bones of sheep, in a game similar to modern jacks. Their games were often physical and rough. They had running races, wrestling matches, and games of tag. A popular game was Hoodman Blind, which is what we call Blind Man's Bluff. They played ball games that were early ancestors of football or soccer, but these were chaotic, often violent affairs with few rules. Play was not just for fun. Like their education, it was often a form of practice for adulthood. A boy playing with a toy sword was learning how to handle a weapon. A girl caring for a doll was mimicking the childcare she would one day perform. Games of skill and strength prepared boys for the physical demands of farming or fighting. The line between work and play was blurry. A child sent to gather berries might eat half of them along the way, turning a chore into a game. A group of boys tasked with watching the sheep might spend the afternoon holding wrestling contests. There was no clear separation between a time for work and a time for leisure. Life was a whole, and play was squeezed in whenever and wherever possible. It was a necessary outlet in a life that was often hard and monotonous. It was a way for children to be children, to use their imaginations, and build their bodies, even as the world was constantly preparing them for the serious business of being an adult. The miniature adult entering the world of work. The image of the medieval child as a miniature adult is one of the most persistent. We see it in paintings children with serious, unsmiling faces dressed in smaller versions of their parents' clothes. This image is partly true and partly misleading. Children were not just small adults. People understood they were physically and emotionally immature, but the transition from childhood to adulthood was much faster and more integrated than it is today. There was no long, protected period of adolescence. As soon as a child was physically capable, they began to participate in the adult world. For many children, this transition began in a formal way between the ages of 12 and 14. This was when they were considered old enough to leave home and start their real training. For a child living in the town, the most common path was an apprenticeship. A boy's parents would sign a legal contract with a master craftsman, like a baker, a carpenter, or a blacksmith. The boy would go to live in the master's house for a set number of years, usually 7. The master agreed to feed, clothe, and house the boy, and to teach him all the secrets of his trade. In return, the boy worked for the master for free. It was a tough life. The apprentice was the lowest member of the household, expected to do all the menial jobs. He was subject to the master's discipline, which could be harsh, but at the end of his term, he would be a skilled craftsman ready to make his own way in the world. For the children of the nobility, the path was different but just as structured. At around age 7, a boy would be sent away from his own home to the castle of a more powerful lord, or even to the royal court. He would start as a page. His job was to serve the lord and lady of the castle. He would learn to wait at tables, to care for clothes, and most importantly, to have good manners. He would be taught to ride a horse, to hunt, and to handle a sword. Around the age of 14, if he proved worthy, he would become a squire. Now his training became more serious. He would be assigned to a specific knight, acting as his personal servant. He would care for the knight's armor and weapons, help him dress for battle, and follow him onto the battlefield. He learned the arts of war firsthand. If he was brave and skillful, he would one day be made a knight himself. For girls, especially noble girls, the path led towards marriage. Their training was focused on becoming the lady of a great household. They learned to spin, weave, and do embroidery. They learned about medicinal herbs. And they learned how to manage a huge staff of servants, how to keep accounts, and how to organize supplies for a castle that could house hundreds of people. A noblewoman was the chief executive of a large and complex operation. Her marriage was not a matter of personal choice or romance. It was a political and economic alliance arranged by her family. A girl could be betrothed as a toddler to seal a treaty, or merge two great estates. Canon law set the age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, meaning they could be married and expected to run a household while they were still children by our standards. Our peasant couples tended to marry later, in their late teens or early 20s, because they had to wait until they could afford to set up their own home. Legally, a child's status was ambiguous. They had fewer rights than an adult. Their father had almost complete control over them. But the law did recognize stages of childhood. Under 7, they were not responsible for their crimes. From 7 to 14, they had a kind of limited responsibility. After 14, they were generally treated as adults by the legal system. They could be witnesses in court, make a will, and be held fully accountable for any crimes they committed. So the miniature adult idea comes from this rapid integration into adult work and responsibility. Children started their life's work at an age when modern children are just starting middle school. Their clothes were practical for the work they did, which was often a smaller version of adult work. Their childhood was not a separate world, but a preparatory stage that happened within the adult world itself. They learned by doing, working alongside the adults they would one day become. The transition was quick, practical, and left little room for the modern idea of a carefree youth. Worlds apart, the noble and the peasant child, there was no single medieval childhood. The experience of growing up was completely defined by the circumstances of your birth. The gap between a peasant child and a noble child was immense, a chasm that was almost impossible to cross. They lived in two entirely different worlds, with different food, different work, different expectations, and different futures. A peasant child was born into a life of labor. Their world was small, often limited to their village and the surrounding fields. From the moment they could walk, they were put to work. A very young child might be tasked with gathering stones from the fields, collecting firewood from the forest, or watching the geese. As they grew older, their jobs became more demanding. A boy would learn the backbreaking work of plowing, scything, and threshing. A girl would learn the endless tasks of running a household, grinding grain into flour by hand, churning butter, brewing ale, spinning wool, and cooking over an open fire. Their lives were governed by the sun and the seasons. Their diet was simple and monotonous. It was mostly bread, usually dark bread made from rye or barley, and a thick vegetable soup or pottage. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps at Christmas or Easter. They lived in small, dark, smoky huts, often sharing the single room with their animals in the winter for warmth. They had few possessions, a wooden spoon, a clay bowl, a rough woolen tunic. Sickness was a constant threat, and medical care was non-existent beyond what a local wise woman could provide with herbs. Their future was set from birth. A peasant boy would grow up to be a peasant man, farming the same strip of land his father and grandfather had farmed. A peasant girl would marry a peasant boy from her own village or a neighboring one. Their life was one of relentless work and obligation to the lord of the manor. A noble child was born into a world of privilege and pressure. Their first experience was often separation. Instead of being nursed by their mother, they were handed over to a wet nurse. They spent their first years in a peasant cottage, only returning to their family's castle as a toddler. Even then, their parents could be distant figures. They were raised by nurses and servants. Their world was one of stone castles, rich tapestries, and plentiful food. They ate meat and fish regularly, used fine tableware, and wore clothes made of wool, linen, and even silk. Their labor was not physical, but intellectual and social. A noble boy's education began early with a private tutor. He would learn to read and write in Latin and French, the language of the aristocracy. He learned about history, music, and courtly etiquette. But his most important training was martial. He spent his days learning to fight with a sword and lance, preparing for his future as a warrior and a leader. A noble girl also had tutors. She might learn to read her prayer book, to play a musical instrument, and to manage a great household. Her entire upbringing was designed to make her a valuable bride. Her future was not her own. Her marriage would be a strategic move to increase her family's power and wealth. There were other childhoods, too. A child born in a growing town might have a life somewhere between these two extremes. If their father was a successful merchant or craftsman, they might live in a comfortable house and have more opportunities than a peasant. They would likely become an apprentice and learn a trade, with the hope of one day owning their own shop and becoming a respected citizen. And there was another path open to children from all classes, the church. Some families would give a child, sometimes as young as 7, to a monastery or convent as an oblet. For a poor family, this meant one less mouth to feed and the chance for their son to get an education. For a noble family, it was a way to provide for a younger son who would not inherit land. Life in a monastery was highly structured, a world of prayer, study, and work, but it offered a security that was rare in the outside world. So, while all medieval children faced the dangers of disease and the strictures of their faith, their daily lives could not have been more different. For most, childhood was short and harsh, a brief preparation for a life of hard labor. For a select few, it was a period of intense training for a future of power and responsibility. The accident of birth determined everything. It decided whether you would spend your days behind a plow or on a war horse, whether you would live in a one-room hut or a sprawling castle. There was no single story of medieval childhood, only a collection of vastly different lives, lived worlds apart.